The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air as I stood beside Grandfather Thomas's mahogany casket. My trembling hands clutched around a single white rose, while Charleston's elite whispered their condolences around me. The October rain drummed against the cathedral's stained glass windows, each drop like tears from heaven for the man who'd been more father than grandfather to me since my parents died 15 years ago. Victoria stood beside me in perfect composure, her black Chanel suit immaculate despite the humidity, her golden hair swept into an elegant chignon that wouldn't dare come undone even in grief. At 31, she commanded attention effortlessly, the beloved granddaughter who'd inherited our grandmother's beauty, and supposedly, our grandfather's business acumen. As the funeral service concluded and mourners began filing out, discussing tomorrow's will reading in hushed tones, Victoria leaned close enough that her breath tickled my ear. Her voice was silk wrapped around steel, barely audible above the murmured conversations. "Don't even bother," she whispered, her lips curved in what appeared to be a sympathetic smile to anyone watching. "I've already secured everything." The words hit me like ice water. I shouldn't have been surprised. Victoria had been positioning herself as grandfather's sole heir since we were teenagers, systematically building her case with the precision of a master strategist. She'd attended every board meeting, charmed every business associate, and maintained the perfect granddaughter facade that everyone expected from Thomas Whitmore's legacy. My chest tightened as I processed her casual cruelty, but I forced myself to remain silent. This was grandfather's funeral, not the arena for family warfare. I owed him more dignity than that, even if Victoria apparently felt no such obligation. She glided away with fluid grace, accepting condolences from Charleston's most prominent families with practiced poise. I watched her work the room like the accomplished performer she was, each gesture calculated to reinforce her image as the grieving but composed heiress prepared to carry on the Whitmore traditions. The funeral director approached with gentle words, but my attention was drawn to a familiar figure near the cathedral's entrance. James Caldwell, grandfather's longtime attorney, stood watching the proceedings with an expression I couldn't decipher, something between concern and anticipation that made my pulse quicken. When our eyes met, he nodded almost imperceptibly, his weathered face holding secrets I couldn't yet imagine. The drive to Whitmore Estate was silent, Victoria absorbed in her phone, while I stared at the ancient oaks that lined our childhood street. The antebellum mansion had sheltered 5 generations of our family, its white columns and wraparound porches testament to old money and older values. That evening, I sat in grandfather's study surrounded by leather-bound books and family portraits that had witnessed countless pivotal moments. This room had been my sanctuary during the dark years after my parents' car accident, where grandfather had helped me heal and taught me about duty, honor, and the responsibilities that came with privilege. If Victoria was right about securing everything, this would be my last night in the space that had shaped my soul. Tomorrow would reveal whether my years of devotion meant anything against her calculated campaign for inheritance. I opened the worn copy of Pride and Prejudice that grandfather had given me for my 21st birthday, finding his inscription, "For Madeline, true worth is often hidden in plain sight. Those with wisdom will recognize it. Love always, grandfather." As I drifted toward sleep, Victoria's whispered threat echoed in my mind. But beneath my fear lay a small seed of hope. 3 weeks ago, grandfather had made me promise to attend the will reading, no matter what anyone says. At the time, it seemed like a simple request for family unity. Now I wondered if there was more to it than sentiment. The sealed envelope that would appear tomorrow contained secrets that would shatter everything we thought we knew about our family. But tonight, I was just a grieving granddaughter, clinging to faith in the man who'd never once let me down. Growing up in Victoria's shadow was like living in permanent eclipse. No matter how brightly I tried to shine, her radiance consumed all available light. From our earliest memories, she possessed an otherworldly perfection that made adults marvel and children envy, while I struggled for even the most basic acknowledgement of my existence. The differences between us were apparent before we could speak. Victoria's first word was beautiful, delivered with a smile that melted hearts across Charleston. Mine was sorry, a fitting beginning for a lifetime of apologizing for taking up space in a world clearly designed for my sister's glory. Our parents, James and Catherine Whitmore, doted on Victoria with the kind of obvious favoritism that left permanent scars on my developing psyche. She received the best bedroom, the newest clothes, and most importantly, their undivided attention during the precious hours they weren't managing the family's shipping empire or social obligations. Victoria has such natural charisma, Mother would say when I was 8, watching my sister charm visiting relatives while I read quietly in the corner. She's going to be a heartbreaker someday, just like her grandmother. I was the afterthought, the unexpected second pregnancy that had complicated their plans for the perfect family portrait. While Victoria took piano lessons and tennis coaching, I spent afternoons with Grandfather Thomas, who seemed to be the only adult who noticed I existed. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March when I was 13 and Victoria was 15. Our parents were driving home from a charity gala when their car hit black ice and rolled into Magnolia Creek. They died instantly, leaving us orphans in a world that had already decided which daughter mattered. Victoria's response to their death was a masterclass in public relations. She delivered a eulogy that reduced the entire cathedral to tears, gave interviews to local newspapers about carrying on our parents' charitable legacy, and somehow managed to look ethereally beautiful, even while grieving. I, meanwhile, retreated into myself so completely that people forgot I'd lost the same parents. The grief counselor said I was processing trauma differently, but the truth was simpler. No one expected emotional depth from the forgotten daughter, so my pain remained invisible. Grandfather Thomas became our guardian, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. While others marveled at Victoria's public composure, he noticed my private struggle. He would find me crying in hidden corners of the house and sit with me until the tears stopped, never offering empty platitudes or false comfort. Grief has its own timeline, sweetheart, he told me one evening as we sat in his study. Don't let anyone tell you how to feel or when to feel it. At Magnolia Preparatory Academy, Victoria flourished while I wilted. She was elected class president 3 years running, starred in every school production, and dated boys from the most prominent families. Her teachers adored her, her classmates worshipped her, and her future seemed limitless. I struggled academically despite being a voracious reader, socially despite desperate attempts to fit in, and emotionally despite weekly therapy sessions. My grades were average, my friendships were few, and my confidence was non-existent. Madeline's just a late bloomer, Victoria would tell concerned teachers and relatives, her voice dripping with sisterly concern that fooled everyone. She's very sensitive, you know. The accident affected her more than it did me. The implication was always that my struggles were weaknesses while her success was strength, that my emotional depth was instability, while her composure was maturity. She positioned herself as the responsible sister caring for her damaged sibling, building sympathy for herself while diminishing my worth. Grandfather saw through her performance, though he never said so directly. He began spending more time with me, teaching me about the family business, sharing stories about his own struggles with loss and disappointment. These conversations became the foundation of our relationship and my self-worth. Intelligence comes in many forms, he told me, when I brought home a disappointing report card. Some people are naturally gifted at performing for others. Others are gifted at understanding deeper truths. Both have value, but only one creates lasting impact. By the time we reached college, Victoria at Vanderbilt, me at the local university, our roles were cemented. She was the golden child destined for greatness, while I was the quiet one who would need family support to survive in the world. But Grandfather's attention never wavered. He visited me weekly, took interest in my environmental science studies, and encouraged my volunteer work with animal rescue organizations. While Victoria charmed Charleston's social scene, I found purpose in caring for creatures that couldn't advocate for themselves. Compassion is the rarest form of intelligence, Grandfather said, when I told him about nursing an abandoned kitten back to health. Anyone can learn facts or master skills, but the ability to see suffering and respond with love, that's a gift that can't be taught. Those words sustained me through years of feeling invisible, years of watching Victoria accumulate accolades while I struggled for basic recognition. I didn't know then that Grandfather was evaluating us both, measuring not just our achievements, but our characters, not just our public personas, but our private choices. The sealed envelope that would soon change everything contained his conclusions about which granddaughter truly understood the difference between being impressive and being important, between commanding attention and earning respect, between inheriting wealth and deserving it. When Grandfather Thomas first mentioned feeling a bit cloudy during our weekly lunch, I dismissed it as normal aging. He was 78, still sharp as a tack in business meetings, still able to recall obscure historical details and quote Shakespeare from memory. But over the following months, the cloudiness became confusion, and I realized we were facing something far more serious than simple forgetfulness. The diagnosis came in early spring. Mild cognitive impairment, potentially the beginning stages of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Richardson delivered the news with clinical gentleness, explaining treatment options and likely progression, while Victoria took detailed notes and asked practical questions about care requirements. "We'll need to discuss arrangements," Victoria said as we left the medical center. "Private nurses, modified living situations, perhaps a transfer to one of those excellent facilities in Savannah. I can research the best options." But grandfather had different ideas. "I want to stay in my own home," he said firmly, "with my own things, my own routines. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left in some sterile institution surrounded by strangers." Victoria's face tightened with frustration. "Grandfather, you can't possibly think it's safe for you to live alone with this condition. You need professional supervision." "I need family," he replied, his eyes finding mine across the dinner table. "Madeline, would you consider moving home? I know it's a lot to ask, but I'd feel more comfortable with someone I trust nearby." The request surprised everyone, including me. I'd been living in a small apartment downtown, working part-time for an environmental consulting firm while finishing my master's degree. Moving back to Whitmore Estate would mean giving up my independence, my job, my carefully constructed adult life. "Of course," I heard myself saying. "Whatever you need, grandfather." Victoria's objection was swift. "Madeline can't possibly provide the level of care you'll require. She has no medical training, no experience with cognitive decline. This decision needs to be based on practical considerations, not sentiment." But grandfather's mind was made up, and within 2 weeks, I'd moved back into my childhood bedroom, transforming my life to revolve around his needs and schedule. The adjustment was more difficult than I'd anticipated, not the caregiving itself, which felt natural and necessary, but the isolation from peers who were building careers and relationships while I changed adult diapers and monitored medication schedules. The work was both heartbreaking and rewarding. On good days, grandfather was his old self, witty, wise, full of stories about Charleston's history and our family's place in it. On bad days, he struggled to remember my name or recognize familiar faces, retreating into confusion that no amount of love could penetrate. Victoria visited twice weekly, always with business documents requiring his signature or decisions about family investments. She treated his cognitive decline as an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a tragedy to be grieved, focusing on practical matters while avoiding emotional intimacy. "You're not helping him by enabling this fantasy of independence," she told me during one of her visits. "He needs structure, routine, professional care. Your emotional attachment is clouding your judgment about what's best for him." But during quiet evening hours when Victoria had returned to her downtown apartment, grandfather and I developed a deeper connection than we'd ever shared. He began telling me stories about his own childhood, his courtship of our grandmother, his struggles to build the family business during economic downturns. "I never told your father some of these things," he confided one night as we sat in his study. "He was always more interested in the bottom line than the backstory. But I think you understand that history matters, that understanding the past helps us make better decisions about the future." These conversations became my education in family legacy, business ethics, and the moral complexities of inherited wealth. Grandfather shared his doubts about some business decisions, his regrets about relationships he'd neglected, his concerns about what would happen to the family's values after he was gone. "Money is like water," he told me one evening, as autumn rain pelted the study windows. "It can nourish growth or cause destructive floods, depending on how wisely it's channeled. The difference between wealth that helps and wealth that harms comes down to the character of the person controlling it." As his condition progressed, grandfather began asking more direct questions about my values, my goals, my understanding of responsibility and privilege. These weren't casual conversations, but careful evaluations, though I didn't recognize them as such at the time. "Tell me about your volunteer work with the animal shelter," he said one afternoon. "What draws you to helping creatures that can't help themselves?" I found myself explaining motivations I'd never articulated before, how working with abandoned animals had taught me about resilience, unconditional love, and the importance of caring for those society discarded. As I spoke, I could see grandfather listening with intense attention, as if my words were confirming something important he'd been wondering about. During his final months, when his lucid moments became increasingly rare, grandfather would still recognize me when he couldn't remember other family members. In those precious intervals of clarity, he would squeeze my hand and whisper, "Thank you for staying. Sweetheart, thank you for not giving up on me. The night before he died, Grandfather called me to his bedside with unusual urgency. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear as he pressed a sealed envelope into my hands. "This is for tomorrow," he whispered. "After the reading, promise me you'll open it only when James tells you to. No matter what anyone else says," I promised, though I couldn't imagine what secrets the envelope might contain. The next morning, he was gone, leaving behind a legacy that none of us truly understood, and a final surprise that would change everything we thought we knew about our family. While I spent 18 months learning to navigate Grandfather's declining health, Victoria orchestrated a campaign for inheritance that was both brilliant and ruthless. Her strategy was masterfully subtle, never obvious enough to seem calculated, but systematic enough to ensure that every important person in Grandfather's life came to see her as his natural successor. She began with the household staff, people who'd worked for our family for decades, and whose opinions Grandfather valued deeply. Suddenly, Victoria was remembering birthdays she'd previously ignored, asking about grandchildren's college plans, and taking personal interest in problems that required her financial assistance to solve. "Miss Victoria helped my daughter get that scholarship to nursing school," I overheard our housekeeper Elena telling the gardener. "She made calls to people at the university, used her connections. That girl has such a generous heart." The generosity Victoria displayed was always strategic, creating networks of loyalty and gratitude that reinforced her image as someone who cared about the people who would depend on the family's continued prosperity. She was building a constituency of supporters who would vouch for her character when the time came. With Grandfather's business associates, Victoria employed a different but equally effective approach. She began attending board meetings as his representative, demonstrating comprehensive knowledge of company operations, while charming longtime partners with her intelligence and social grace. "Thomas's granddaughter really impressed me at the Maritime Association meeting," I heard one of his partners tell him during a dinner party. "She understood the complexities of the new environmental regulations better than some people who've been in shipping for decades. You've trained her well." Victoria had indeed educated herself thoroughly about every aspect of the family businesses, but she'd also hired private consultants and tutors to ensure her presentations were flawless. Every public appearance was carefully orchestrated to showcase her competence, while making her preparation invisible to observers who saw only natural aptitude. Perhaps most brilliantly, Victoria managed to position my caregiving role as evidence of her own thoughtfulness and family devotion. When people asked why I'd moved home to help care for Grandfather, she would smile warmly and explain how she'd encouraged me to spend this precious time with him. "I knew how much Madeline would regret it if she didn't have these months with Grandfather," she would say, her voice rich with sisterly affection. "I'm so busy with the business responsibilities that I can't be there as much as I'd like, so it's wonderful that she can provide the emotional support he needs." The narrative she created was perfect. Victoria was the responsible granddaughter handling practical matters, while I was the sentimental one providing comfort care. Both roles were valuable, but only one suggested fitness for inheritance. Victoria's manipulation of social situations was particularly masterful. At charity galas and family gatherings, she would guide conversations in ways that highlighted her achievements while positioning my contributions as well-meaning but ultimately amateur. "Madeline's environmental work is so admirable," she would say with apparent sincerity. "She's always been passionate about saving the world. It's such a luxury to be able to pursue idealistic causes when you don't have to worry about practical responsibilities." The word idealistic was particularly clever, suggesting that my environmental consulting work was more about good intentions than real-world impact, while luxury implied that my ability to choose meaningful work was possible only because others handled the serious business of wealth management. She also began subtle campaigns to limit my access to important family information. When business calls came to the house, Victoria would intercept them before they reached Grandfather, claiming she was protecting him from unnecessary stress. When lawyers and accountants requested meetings, she would schedule them during times when I was likely to be occupied with caregiving duties. "I didn't want to burden you with technical details," she would explain, when I discovered important conversations had happened without me. "Grandfather specifically said he didn't want you distracted from spending quality time with him." Whether Grandfather had actually said this was impossible to verify, but it sounded plausible enough that I didn't question Victoria's explanations. I was focused on making the most of our remaining time together, not on monitoring inheritance politics. Victoria's most effective strategy was creating a public narrative about our different strengths that made her inheritance seem inevitable. She was the granddaughter who understood business, while I was the one who understood emotions. She was prepared for leadership, while I was suited for supporting roles. She had always been the responsible one, while I was the artistic one who needed guidance. "Madeline is so gifted in her own way," Victoria would tell family friends when they asked about our different career paths. "Not everyone is cut out for the pressures of running major corporations. She's much happier working with environmental causes and volunteer organizations. It suits her gentle personality perfectly." The implications were crystal clear. I was too sensitive and impractical for serious business leadership, while Victoria had the tough-minded competence required to manage the Whitmore empire. My interests were portrayed as hobbies suitable for someone who would be financially supported by the family, rather than responsible for supporting it. By the time grandfather's final illness began, Victoria had successfully positioned herself as the obvious heir in the minds of everyone who mattered. Business partners assumed she would take over operations. Staff members looked to her for leadership, and family friends treated her as the de facto head of the next generation. What none of us realized was that grandfather had been watching Victoria's campaign with the sharp attention of someone whose business acumen remained largely intact despite his medical diagnosis. He was observing not just her competence, which was undeniable, but her methods, her motivations, and her understanding of what family wealth should actually accomplish. The sealed envelope that would soon shatter Victoria's confidence contained his evaluation of her character, and that evaluation would prove far more damning than her carefully managed public image suggested. 3 weeks before grandfather died, he called me into his study with an urgency I hadn't heard in his voice for months. His Alzheimer's symptoms had been worsening steadily, but that afternoon his eyes held a clarity that reminded me of the sharp businessman who'd built our family's fortune from modest beginnings. "Madeline, I need to share something with you," he said, gesturing for me to close the study door. "Something about Victoria that I've discovered. Something that changes everything I thought I knew about her character." The gravity in his voice made my stomach clench with apprehension. Despite our complicated relationship, Victoria was still my sister, and I wasn't prepared for whatever truth had put that expression of profound disappointment on grandfather's face. He pulled a manila folder from his desk drawer, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal bank statements, investment records, and legal documents that meant nothing to me but clearly represented hours of careful investigation. "For the past 2 years, Victoria has been systematically embezzling from the family's charitable foundation," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal. "Small amounts at first, but gradually increasing to substantial sums. She's been using her position as my representative to funnel money into accounts controlled by organizations she has financial stakes in." The accusation hit me like cold water. Victoria, stealing from charities? It seemed impossible to reconcile with the poised, ethical granddaughter everyone admired, the woman who'd built her entire identity around serving others and upholding family values. "Are you sure?" I asked weakly, though grandfather's documentation looked comprehensive and damning. "I hired a forensic accountant to investigate some irregularities I noticed in our quarterly reports," he explained. "What they found goes far beyond simple bookkeeping errors. Victoria has been running a sophisticated operation, using charitable donations to pay inflated consulting fees to companies she secretly owns, organizing fundraising events that primarily benefit her social network, and redirecting funds designated for direct service into administrative expenses that serve her personal interests." He showed me canceled checks, wire transfer records, and incorporation documents that revealed a web of financial relationships designed to enrich Victoria while maintaining the appearance of charitable work. The scheme was complex enough to avoid criminal prosecution, but clear enough to constitute a fundamental betrayal of trust. The total amount diverted over 2 years is approximately $800,000, grandfather continued. Money that should have gone to literacy programs, homeless services, and educational scholarships was instead used to enhance Victoria's social standing and business prospects. As the implications sank in, I felt sick, not just because of the money, though that was substantial, but because of what the theft revealed about Victoria's character. She'd been stealing from the very people our family was supposed to help, using her position of trust to exploit the vulnerable for personal gain. "Why haven't you confronted her?" I asked. Grandfather's expression grew even more grave. "Because I discovered something else, something that makes this betrayal even more personal. Victoria has been manipulating my medication." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, too terrible to fully process. "What do you mean?" "She's been adjusting my Alzheimer's medication doses, sometimes increasing them to make me more confused during important business meetings, sometimes decreasing them when she needs me alert enough to sign documents, he explained. Dr. Richardson confirmed that the prescription changes supposedly made at my request were actually requested by Victoria, using medical power of attorney documents I never signed. I stared at him in horror, understanding finally why his symptoms had seemed to fluctuate so unpredictably, why some days he was completely lucid, while others he could barely remember my name. She's been controlling my cognitive function to manipulate business decisions and family relationships, Grandfather continued, making me appear more incompetent than I actually am to justify her increasing control over family affairs, while ensuring I'm clear-headed enough to approve financial transactions that benefit her interests. The scope of Victoria's deception was breathtaking. She hadn't just been positioning herself for inheritance. She'd been actively sabotaging Grandfather's health and mental clarity to accelerate her takeover of family assets. "I've been documenting everything," he said, showing me photographs of pill bottles with incorrect dosage instructions, audio recordings of conversations with confused medical staff, and detailed logs of his symptoms correlating with Victoria's visits. "My lawyer has copies of all this evidence, along with instructions about how it should be used." "What are you going to do?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand why he'd made me promise to attend the will reading regardless of what anyone said. Grandfather's smile was sad, but determined. "I'm going to ensure that someone with genuine integrity inherits the responsibility for our family's wealth, someone who understands that privilege creates obligations rather than opportunities for exploitation." Over the following days, Grandfather shared more details about Victoria's manipulation, how she'd convinced business partners that his declining mental state made him an unreliable decision-maker, how she'd used inside information about family investments to make profitable trades in her personal accounts, how she'd leveraged her position as his apparent heir to secure favorable business deals for her own ventures. "The most heartbreaking part," he told me during one of our final conversations, "is that Victoria genuinely believes she's entitled to this wealth, that her intelligence and social skills give her the right to inherit regardless of her methods. She doesn't understand that character matters more than competence when it comes to managing family legacy." The sealed envelope he pressed into my hands the night before he died contained not just his final wishes, but comprehensive evidence of Victoria's betrayal and manipulation. It was his insurance policy against her attempts to contest whatever surprises his will might contain. "Promise me," he whispered with his dying breath, "that you'll use this wisely, not for revenge, but for justice, not to destroy Victoria, but to protect the people she would harm if she inherited the power she craves." I promised, though I couldn't have imagined the stunning revelations that awaited in that envelope, revelations that would transform not just my understanding of Victoria's character, but my comprehension of my own place in our family's complicated history. The morning after Grandfather's funeral, I found myself alone in his study, holding the sealed envelope he'd pressed into my hands during his final hours. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it contained not just paper, but the accumulated secrets of our entire family history. I'd promised not to open it until James Caldwell gave me permission, but the temptation was overwhelming. What could Grandfather have wanted to tell me that required such secrecy? What truth was so sensitive that it needed to wait until after his death? The answer would have to wait until the will reading, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the envelope contained would change everything I thought I knew about our family. Grandfather's expression when he'd given it to me, part love, part regret, part desperate hope, suggested revelations that went far beyond Victoria's financial manipulations. That afternoon, while Victoria was downtown handling funeral arrangements and fielding condolence calls, I retreated to the attic where our family's oldest documents and photographs were stored. If Grandfather had secrets to share, perhaps there were clues hidden among the memorabilia that chronicled 5 generations of Whitmore history. I found what I was looking for in a cedar chest that hadn't been opened in decades, a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon, written in a handwriting I recognized but couldn't immediately place. The return address was a Charleston hotel, dated 32 years ago, addressed to "My dearest Catherine." Catherine had been my mother's name. With trembling hands, I untied the ribbon and began reading letters that would shatter my understanding of everything I'd believed about my parentage and place in the Whitmore family. The handwriting was Grandfather's, but younger, more passionate, filled with declarations of love that made my stomach clench with growing horror. "My darling Catherine, I know this is wrong, but I cannot stop myself from loving you. You are everything beautiful and pure in this world, and I am a foolish old man who has lost his heart to someone he can never deserve." The letters chronicled a passionate affair between Grandfather Thomas and my mother, conducted in secret during the year before my birth. They met in hotel rooms, exchanged gifts through intermediaries, and planned a future together that they both knew was impossible. "Your husband suspects nothing," one letter read. "James believes the child you carry is his, and perhaps it's better that way. I cannot give you the kind of life you deserve, the social standing you need, the security your children require, but know that my love for you and our child will endure long after this affair must end." Our child. The words swam before my eyes as the implications crashed over me like a tsunami. I wasn't Thomas Whitmore's granddaughter. I was his daughter. The man I'd called grandfather for 30 years was actually my biological father, hidden in plain sight to protect both our reputations and preserve my mother's marriage. More letters revealed the painful details of their separation. Mother had chosen to stay with her husband James, the man I'd believed was my father, rather than destroy his political career and social standing by revealing her affair. Grandfather had accepted her decision, agreeing to love me from a distance while maintaining the fiction that I was his granddaughter, rather than his child. "I will watch over her always," he'd written in his final letter to my mother. "She will never want for anything, education, opportunities, love, even if I cannot claim her as my own. Perhaps someday when she's old enough to understand, we can tell her the truth. Until then, I will be the best grandfather I can be, and you must be the mother she deserves." But that someday had never come. My mother had died in the car accident when I was 13, taking the secret with her to the grave. Grandfather had been forced to continue the charade, loving his biological daughter while pretending she was merely his granddaughter, watching her struggle with feelings of inadequacy while being unable to explain why his affection for her ran so much deeper than typical familial bonds. Everything made sense now. Why grandfather had always seemed to understand me in ways that others didn't. Why he'd encouraged my interests when everyone else dismissed them. Why he'd asked me to move home during his illness. He wasn't just a loving grandfather. He was a father trying to make up for 30 years of hidden relationship with his child. The revelation explained so much about our family dynamics. Victoria wasn't just my sister. She was my half-sister, sharing a grandfather, but not the biological connection that had always made me feel somehow different, somehow more connected to him than genetics should have allowed. It also explained Victoria's resentment toward me, the way she'd always seemed to sense that grandfather's affection for me was deeper than his fondness for her. She'd attributed it to favoritism or special pleading for the damaged sister, never realizing that his love for me was fundamentally different because I was his child, not his grandchild. As I sat surrounded by letters that rewrote my entire identity, I understood why grandfather had insisted I promise to attend the will reading. He'd probably changed his will to reflect the truth about our relationship, finally acknowledging me as his daughter rather than his granddaughter. The sealed envelope likely contained legal documents proving my parentage and explaining his decision to reveal the secret after 3 decades of hiding. But understanding the truth also filled me with profound sadness. Grandfather had spent my entire life longing to claim me as his daughter, but being forced to maintain a fiction that diminished our relationship. Every birthday, every graduation, every milestone had been tinged with the pain of a father who couldn't publicly acknowledge his child. The love I'd always felt from him, deeper and more constant than anything I'd received from the man I'd believed was my father, finally made sense. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just been the grandfather who saved me after my parents died. He'd been my actual father, watching his daughter struggle with identity and belonging, while being unable to explain why she mattered to him more than anyone else in the world. Tomorrow's will reading would reveal not just inheritance decisions, but family truths that had been buried for decades. The sealed envelope contained more than legal documents. It contained a father's love letter to the daughter he'd never been able to claim. The mahogany conference table at Caldwell & Associates gleamed under crystal chandeliers that had witnessed 5 generations of Whitmore family business, its polished surface reflecting the October morning light that streamed through tall windows overlooking Charleston's historic district. I sat across from Victoria, my hands folded to hide their trembling, while she exuded the confident composure of someone about to receive a crown. James Caldwell entered with the deliberate movements of a man carrying momentous news. At 73, he'd handled our family's legal affairs for 4 decades, his silver hair and measured demeanor inspiring confidence in even the most complex estate matters. But this morning, his usual composure seemed strained, his eyes holding the weight of secrets that would forever alter our understanding of family and inheritance. "Thank you both for your punctuality," he began, settling into his chair with careful precision. "Your grandfather's will is straightforward in most respects, but there are some unusual provisions that require careful explanation." Victoria leaned forward with eager anticipation, her designer black suit and perfectly styled hair marking her as a woman prepared to step immediately into the role of family matriarch. She'd spent the morning at her apartment preparing for this moment. I'd seen her practicing gracious acceptance speeches in the mirror when I'd stopped by to offer her a ride. "The basic bequests are as follows," Mr. Caldwell continued, opening the formal document. "To Victoria Whitmore, I leave my collection of first edition books, my antique furniture collection, and the sum of $2 million. Victoria's smile widened at the substantial bequest, though I could see her calculating whether this represented the bulk of grandfather's estate or merely a generous portion. "To Madeline Whitmore, I leave my art collection, my jewelry collection, and the sum of $2 million. I felt a jolt of surprise at being named an equal beneficiary, though $2 million seemed like an impossible fortune to someone who'd been living on graduate student wages. The remainder of the estate, including Whitmore Industries, Whitmore Estate, and all associated business interests," Mr. Caldwell continued, "totaling approximately $48 million. I leave to—" He paused, his eyes meeting mine with an expression that suggested he was bracing for explosive reactions. "I leave to my daughter, Madeline Catherine Whitmore." The words hit the room like lightning. Victoria's face went completely white, her mouth falling open in shock as she processed information that contradicted everything she'd believed about our family structure. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Madeline is his granddaughter, not his daughter. There must be some mistake." "But Mr. Caldwell was already reaching for the sealed envelope that had been sitting on his desk throughout the reading, its presence a mystery until this moment when it would explain everything. "Your grandfather insisted that this codicil be read only after the basic will provisions were announced," he said, breaking the wax seal with ceremonial precision. "He wanted both his granddaughter and his daughter, to understand the inheritance structure before learning the family history that explains his decisions." Victoria stared at me with a mixture of shock and rage, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling as she realized that her greatest rival for inheritance wasn't her sister, but her aunt, that the quiet, overlooked family member she'd spent years undermining was actually grandfather's biological child and legitimate heir. Mr. Caldwell removed several documents from the envelope, consulting them carefully before continuing. "The codicil contains a detailed explanation of Madeline's parentage, including DNA evidence, witness statements, and correspondence that confirms Thomas Whitmore was her biological father." "This is insane," Victoria said, her voice rising with desperate authority. "Even if this were true, which I don't believe, it doesn't change anything legally. Madeline was raised as his granddaughter. She has no claim to inheritance based on some secret paternity that was never legally acknowledged." "But Mr. Caldwell was shaking his head gently. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore took steps to legally acknowledge Madeline as his daughter 6 months ago, including amended birth certificates and formal adoption papers that establish her legal status as his heir. The inheritance is completely valid under South Carolina law." The revelation that grandfather had legally claimed me as his daughter during his final months filled me with emotions too complex to process. Love, gratitude, grief, and overwhelming responsibility crashed over me in waves as I realized that the man I'd cared for during his illness had been my actual father, finally able to acknowledge our relationship in the only way that mattered. "There's more," Mr. Caldwell said, consulting additional documents from the envelope. "Mr. Whitmore's letter explains that his decision to reveal Madeline's parentage and alter his inheritance plans was influenced by discoveries about Victoria's character and behavior that made him question her fitness to inherit family wealth." Victoria's face had gone from white to gray, her confidence evaporating as she realized that grandfather hadn't just chosen me over her, he'd rejected her completely based on evidence she'd thought was safely hidden. "What discoveries?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Mr. Caldwell's expression grew grave as he read from grandfather's final letter. "Victoria has been systematically embezzling from our family's charitable foundations, manipulating my medication to control my cognitive function, and using her position as my apparent heir to enrich herself at the expense of the people our family is supposed to serve." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a fire that would consume Victoria's reputation and future prospects. Everything she'd worked for, every relationship she'd cultivated, every plan she'd made was crashing down around her, as the truth about her character was finally exposed to daylight. "This is a lie," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "A sick old man manipulated by medication and illness, convinced to betray his own family by someone who—" "The evidence is comprehensive," Mr. Caldwell interrupted gently. "Bank records, audio recordings, witness statements, and medical documentation that support every accusation." Mr. Whitmore was very thorough in his investigation. As the reading concluded, and the magnitude of my inheritance began to sink in, I looked across the table at Victoria and saw not the confident sister who dominated our relationship for 30 years, but a stranger whose entire identity had been built on deception and manipulation. The sealed envelope had contained more than legal documents. It had contained the truth about who we really were, beneath the roles we'd been playing our entire lives. I wasn't the overlooked granddaughter who'd inherited through sentiment. I was the daughter who'd finally been acknowledged and claimed by her father. And Victoria wasn't the natural heir who'd been robbed of her birthright. She was the manipulative fraud who'd been exposed before she could complete her plan to steal wealth that had never belonged to her in the first place. The silence that followed Mr. Caldwell's revelations stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of Charleston traffic and Victoria's sharp, irregular breathing. She sat motionless in her leather chair, her perfect composure finally cracking as the magnitude of her exposure settled into her consciousness. "I need to see the evidence," she said finally, her voice hollow but defiant. "Bank records can be fabricated, audio recordings can be doctored. A dying man's accusations aren't proof of anything, Mr. Caldwell nodded sympathetically and withdrew a thick folder from his briefcase. "Your grandfather anticipated this response. He was very methodical in documenting his discoveries. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Bank statements showing $823,000 in unauthorized transfers from charitable accounts to organizations Victoria secretly controlled, audio recordings of her conversations with medical staff, altering grandfather's prescriptions while claiming to act on his behalf, photographs of pill bottles with incorrect dosage instructions in Victoria's handwriting. The most disturbing evidence," Mr. Caldwell continued, "concerns the systematic medication manipulation. Mr. Whitmore began suspecting something was wrong when his symptoms seemed to fluctuate based on your visits, rather than following normal disease progression. He played an audio recording that made my blood run cold. Victoria's voice instructing a confused pharmacy technician to increase grandfather's dosage, per the patient's request, knowing the higher dose would leave him confused and pliable during important business meetings. Dr. Richardson confirmed that the prescription changes supposedly requested by your grandfather were actually initiated by Victoria using medical power of attorney documents that contained forged signatures," Mr. Caldwell explained. Victoria's face cycled through emotions: shock, denial, calculation, and finally a cold rage that was more frightening than her earlier desperation. "Even if all this were true," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "it doesn't change the fundamental injustice of this inheritance. I spent years positioning myself to inherit, making sacrifices, building relationships, preparing for responsibility. Madeline contributed nothing except playing nursemaid to a sick old man. The casual cruelty of her words, reducing my months of loving care to playing nursemaid, revealed the depth of her sociopathy. Even faced with evidence of her own crimes, Victoria was more concerned with her lost inheritance than with the harm she'd caused to the grandfather who'd loved us both. There's additional evidence that influenced Mr. Whitmore's decision," Mr. Caldwell said, consulting another section of documents. "Information about Victoria's financial activities that extends beyond the charitable foundation embezzlement. The new revelations were even more damaging. Victoria had been using insider information about family business decisions to make profitable trades in her personal investment accounts. She'd leveraged her position as grandfather's apparent heir to secure favorable loan terms and business deals that enriched her while exposing the family to financial risk. The total value of Victoria's unauthorized financial activities over the past 3 years is approximately $1.4 million, Mr. Caldwell read from grandfather's letter. Money that was stolen from charitable causes, earned through securities fraud, or obtained through misrepresentation of her authority to act on behalf of family interests. But the most heartbreaking evidence was personal, rather than financial. Grandfather had documented Victoria's emotional manipulation, how she'd isolated him from longtime friends, controlled his access to information, and systematically undermined his relationships with anyone who might question her authority. She convinced me that several of my oldest friends were trying to take advantage of my illness, grandfather had written. She intercepted phone calls, screened visitors, and created an environment where I became increasingly dependent on her for social contact and emotional support. Only later did I realize this isolation was deliberate, designed to ensure that I would see her as my only reliable family connection. The pattern of abuse was sophisticated and cruel. Victoria had essentially imprisoned grandfather in his own home, controlling his medication to manage his cognitive function, limiting his social interactions to prevent outside influence, and manipulating his business decisions to serve her financial interests. Your grandfather's final months were spent gathering this evidence, Mr. Caldwell explained. He hired investigators, consulted with medical experts, and worked with financial analysts to document the full scope of Victoria's deception. He wanted to ensure that his decision to change his inheritance plans was based on comprehensive evidence rather than speculation or family favoritism. The folder also contained character references that painted a devastating portrait of Victoria's true nature. Business associates described her as manipulative and untrustworthy. Charitable organization leaders reported concerns about her financial management and ethical standards. Even household staff members had provided statements about her treatment of grandfather during his illness. The consensus among people who worked closely with Victoria, Mr. Caldwell read, is that she views other people as resources to be exploited rather than relationships to be honored. Her intelligence and social skills have been used consistently to advance her own interests at the expense of family welfare and charitable missions. As the evidence mounted, I found myself grieving not just for grandfather's suffering, but for the sister I'd thought I knew. The Victoria revealed in these documents was a stranger, cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless in her pursuit of wealth and power. There's one final section, Mr. Caldwell said, his voice gentling as he reached the most personal part of grandfather's letter, his explanation of why he chose to reveal Madeline's parentage and acknowledge her as his daughter. Madeline spent 18 months caring for me without expectation of reward or recognition, grandfather had written. She sacrificed her independence, her career prospects, and her social life to ensure that my final months were filled with dignity and love rather than the clinical efficiency that Victoria recommended. She demonstrated the kind of selfless devotion that cannot be performed or calculated. It can only come from genuine love. More importantly, the letter continued, Madeline has consistently shown the moral character required to manage inherited wealth responsibly. Her environmental work, her volunteer activities, and her approach to family relationships all reflect an understanding that privilege creates obligations to serve others rather than opportunities to exploit them. The reading concluded with grandfather's hope that I would use the inheritance to repair the damage Victoria had caused and to establish charitable programs that would honor our family's values rather than exploit them for personal gain. As Mr. Caldwell gathered the documents that had transformed my understanding of everything, I looked across the table at Victoria and saw a woman whose entire identity had been exposed as a carefully constructed lie. The confident heiress was revealed as a criminal, the devoted granddaughter as a manipulative abuser, the family leader as a parasite who'd fed on the very people she was supposed to protect. The truth had finally emerged from decades of secrets, but the cost of that revelation would reshape our family forever. The conference room erupted the moment Mr. Caldwell finished reading grandfather's final condemnation. Victoria shot to her feet with such violence that her chair toppled backward, clattering against the hardwood floor like gunshots in the stunned silence. "This is fraud!" she screamed, her cultivated composure finally shattering completely. "A massive conspiracy to steal my inheritance. No court in the country will allow this travesty to stand." Her transformation was terrifying to witness. The poised society princess had vanished, replaced by something feral and desperate. Her face was flushed with rage, her perfectly styled hair disheveled from her explosive movement, her blue eyes blazing with hatred so pure it made me shrink back in my chair. "You," she snarled, turning the full force of her fury on me. "You manipulative little snake. You spent months poisoning his mind against me while playing the devoted caregiver. But I know what you really are. A pathetic charity case who seduced a sick old man into believing your lies." Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Victoria, I understand this is shocking news, but the evidence supporting both Madeline's parentage and your activities is comprehensive and legally sound. Perhaps you should consult with your own attorney before— Evidence can be fabricated, Victoria interrupted, her voice rising to a shriek that seemed to rattle the windows, especially when it's produced by someone with access to family resources and the ability to manipulate a man suffering from dementia. This entire inheritance is built on elder abuse and fraud. She began pacing the conference room like a caged animal, her movements sharp and erratic as she processed the magnitude of her loss. Everything she'd worked for, the years of strategic positioning, the careful relationship management, the systematic elimination of potential rivals, had been destroyed by revelations she'd never seen coming. "I'll challenge every aspect of this will," she declared, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "The parentage claims, the mental competency evaluations, the validity of the evidence. I'll prove that grandfather was manipulated by a fortune hunter who exploited his illness for financial gain." The accusations stung, because they twisted my genuine love for grandfather into something calculating and mercenary. But I also recognized them as projection. Victoria was describing her own behavior while attributing it to me, unable to comprehend that someone might care for an elderly family member without ulterior motives. "Victoria," I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time since the reading began. "I never knew about the inheritance changes. I never knew I was his daughter. I cared for grandfather because I loved him, not because I expected anything in return." Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. How convenient. The innocent little nurse who just happened to isolate him from his real family while filling his head with lies about my character. "Do you really expect anyone to believe this saint act?" Mr. Caldwell intervened before I could respond. "Mrs. Victoria, I should inform you that your grandfather anticipated legal challenges and took extensive precautions to protect his final wishes. In addition to the evidence we've discussed, he arranged for video testimony, independent psychiatric evaluations, and witness statements from multiple sources." Victoria's pacing stopped abruptly as she processed this information. "What kind of witnesses?" "Household staff members who observed your treatment of Mr. Whitmore," Mr. Caldwell replied calmly. "Business associates who can testify about your financial irregularities. Medical professionals who documented the medication manipulation. Your grandfather was very thorough in building a case that would withstand legal scrutiny." The revelation that grandfather had been systematically documenting her behavior seemed to deflate some of Victoria's rage, replacing it with calculation as she began assessing her legal position. But the cold analytical thinking that had served her well in business only made her current situation more frightening. "How much?" she asked suddenly, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more menacing than her earlier screaming. "I'm sorry?" Mr. Caldwell looked confused. "How much will it cost to make this go away?" Victoria clarified, her eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. "Everyone has a price, and I'm sure dear Madeline would be reasonable about sharing her unexpected windfall with the sister who's been supporting the family business for years." The offer, or threat, hung in the air like smoke. Victoria was proposing to buy my silence about her crimes in exchange for a portion of the inheritance she believed should have been hers by right. "The inheritance isn't for sale," I said firmly, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "And neither is justice for what you did to grandfather." Victoria's expression shifted to something that chilled my blood. "Justice," she repeated, her voice silky with implied menace. "Let's talk about justice, little sister. You think you've won something here, but you have no idea what you're up against. I've spent years building relationships in this city, creating networks of influence and obligation. I know secrets about people who matter, secrets that could destroy careers and reputations." She stepped closer to my chair, looming over me with the kind of physical intimidation that had worked throughout our childhood. "I could make your life very difficult, Madeline. Your environmental consulting business depends on clients who value discretion and reputation. What do you think happens to your career when word spreads that you're a manipulative gold digger who exploited an elderly man's illness?" The threat was clear. If I didn't cooperate with her demands, Victoria would wage a campaign of character assassination that could destroy not just my inheritance, but my entire professional future. But something had changed in me during those months of caring for grandfather, something that made Victoria's intimidation tactics powerless rather than terrifying. I'd learned about real courage from a man who'd spent his final months exposing a beloved family member's crimes because truth mattered more than comfort. "Do whatever you think you need to do," I said, standing to face her directly. "But grandfather's final wishes will be honored, and the evidence of your crimes will be preserved. You can try to destroy my reputation, But you can't change the facts about what you did to him. Victoria's face contorted with rage at my refusal to be intimidated. This isn't over, she hissed. Not even close. I'll challenge this will in every court in South Carolina. I'll expose every detail of your supposed parentage. I'll make sure everyone in Charleston knows exactly what kind of person you really are. She gathered her purse with jerky movements, her composure completely shattered by the morning's revelations. Enjoy your victory while it lasts, dear sister, because I promise you, by the time I'm finished, you'll wish you'd never been born. The conference room door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the antique frames holding Mr. Caldwell's law degree, leaving behind a silence that felt like the aftermath of a natural disaster. As I sat alone with the lawyer who'd delivered news that changed everything, I realized that Victoria's threats didn't frighten me the way they once would have. I'd found something during those months with grandfather that was stronger than her manipulation. The knowledge that doing right matters more than being comfortable, and that some inheritances are worth fighting for regardless of the cost. 6 months after the will reading, I stood in grandfather's renovated study, my father's study, watching morning light stream through windows that now looked out on a garden restored to its former beauty. The room had been transformed from a monument to old money into a working space where the Harrison Thomas Whitmore Foundation conducted its mission of environmental protection, educational opportunity, and social justice. The legal challenges Victoria had promised never materialized. Her attorney had taken one look at grandfather's comprehensive evidence and advised her that contesting the will would only result in criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and elder abuse. Instead, she'd quietly left Charleston, reportedly moving to Atlanta where her reputation hadn't yet been destroyed by scandal. The foundation's work had begun immediately, starting with restitution to the charitable organizations Victoria had robbed and expanding to programs that honored grandfather's values while addressing modern challenges. We'd established scholarship funds for underprivileged students, environmental restoration projects in low-income communities, and elder care advocacy programs that protected vulnerable seniors from the kind of abuse grandfather had suffered. My favorite initiative was the Whitmore Family Literacy Center, housed in what had once been Victoria's downtown apartment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Space that had symbolized her selfish ambitions now served children who needed advocates and opportunities. Miss Madeline, Elena, our longtime housekeeper, appeared in the study doorway with the afternoon mail. There's a letter here that might interest you. The envelope was cream-colored stationery, expensive but not ostentatious, addressed in handwriting I recognized despite having seen it only once before. Victoria's name was embossed in the upper left corner, with an Atlanta return address. I opened it carefully, unsure what to expect from the sister who'd threatened to destroy my life 6 months earlier. Dear Madeline, the letter began, and I was surprised by the humble tone, so different from Victoria's usual commanding voice. I know I have no right to contact you after everything I did, but I wanted you to know that I'm receiving treatment for the psychological issues that led to my behavior. My therapist helped me understand that my actions weren't just criminal. They were the symptoms of deeper problems with empathy, impulse control, and the inability to form genuine relationships. I won't insult you by claiming I didn't know what I was doing was wrong, because I did know. Every time I adjusted grandfather's medication, every time I stole from the charitable accounts, every time I manipulated people who trusted me, I knew exactly how harmful my actions were. I just convinced myself that I deserved whatever I could take, because the world owed me something for being beautiful and intelligent. The hardest part of therapy has been accepting that I spent 30 years building my identity around a lie. I'm not the perfect granddaughter who deserved to inherit family wealth. I'm not the natural leader who could have managed our legacy better than anyone else. I'm a damaged person who caused tremendous harm to people who loved me, including you. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for reconciliation. I just wanted you to know that grandfather chose correctly. You understood something about love and responsibility that I never learned, and our family's wealth is safer in your hands than it ever would have been in mine. I hope the foundation brings you joy and purpose. Grandfather would be proud of the work you're doing in his memory. With regret and respect, Victoria. I read the letter 3 times, processing emotions too complex for easy categorization. Victoria's crimes couldn't be excused by mental health explanations, but her acknowledgement of harm and acceptance of consequences suggested the possibility of genuine change. That evening, I called Mr. Caldwell and asked him to locate Victoria's current address. 2 weeks later, I was sitting across from her in a small cafe in Atlanta, barely recognizing the woman who'd once commanded every room she entered. Victoria looked older, smaller somehow, her trademark confidence replaced by something that might have been humility. She wore simple clothes instead of designer suits. Her hair was styled for convenience rather than effect, and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes from confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "But I wanted to understand something. In your letter, you mentioned therapy and treatment. Are you getting better?" Victoria's smile was sad but genuine. "I'm learning to be better. The therapist says I have what's called narcissistic personality disorder, complicated by antisocial traits that made me capable of harming people without feeling appropriate guilt. It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation for why I could love grandfather and abuse him simultaneously." We talked for 2 hours about her treatment, her attempts to make amends to people she'd harmed, and her efforts to build a life based on genuine relationships, rather than manipulation and exploitation. The conversation was painful for both of us, but it was also healing in ways I hadn't expected. "I can't undo what I did to grandfather," Victoria said as our meeting concluded, "but I can try to prevent other people from making the same mistakes I made. I'm volunteering with elder abuse prevention programs here, sharing my story to help people recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation." 6 months later, Victoria returned to Charleston for the anniversary of grandfather's death. We met at his grave, 2 sisters who'd finally learned to see each other clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of competition and resentment. "He knew," Victoria said, placing flowers on the headstone that bore our father's name. "He knew I was sick long before I understood it myself. That's why he documented everything so carefully. Not to destroy me, but to protect the family from someone who couldn't control her own destructive impulses." Standing in the cemetery where our complicated family story had begun to unravel, I finally understood the full scope of grandfather's love. He'd protected me by revealing the truth about my parentage, but he'd also protected Victoria by ensuring her crimes were exposed before they escalated to the point of criminal prosecution. "What happens now?" Victoria asked as we prepared to leave. I thought about the Foundation's work, the lives we were changing, the legacy of love that had emerged from decades of family secrets and pain. Now we honor what he taught us about second chances, redemption, and the possibility that broken people can learn to do better. The sealed envelope that had shocked everyone at the will reading had contained more than legal documents. It had contained a father's final gift to both his daughters. For me, it was acknowledgement and inheritance. For Victoria, it was consequence and the opportunity for rehabilitation. Both were acts of love, different, but equally transformative. Grandfather had given us what we needed rather than what we wanted, and in doing so, he'd shown us that the best inheritances aren't financial, but moral. The knowledge that people can change, families can heal, and love is always stronger than the forces that try to divide us. The foundation that bore his name would continue his work for generations, but his greatest legacy was simpler and more profound. The understanding that every person deserves the chance to become better than they've been, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior. Standing beside my sister in the place where our father rested, I realized that we'd both inherited exactly what we needed to become the people he'd always hoped we could be.